One day builds, we're back. I'm sorry it's been so long, but we are going to ease into it with some scratch building. Now, I did a scratch building video untested last year, Scratch Building 101, and I replicated drawing from Mobius, from a Mobius comic strip. This time, I'm gonna do scratch building, I guess, 102. This is the follow-up class. This time, instead of square boxes with details, I am going to actually make a more sculpted shape, and I'm going to show you how a model maker would do that in a model shop. It starts with a piece of material like this. This is a urethane foam called Wren Shape. It comes in many different grades. It's used in the prototyping industry for machining prototypes before you machine them in metal. And it's used in the film industry for making model bucks for vacuum forming, which is going to be one of the centerpieces of this one-day build. Because I don't know, have I broken this out before? I can't remember if I've broken. This is my vacuum form machine. I built this about 25 years ago. Fawn Davis of Fawnco and I both decided to replicate our mentor Mitch Romanowski's professional vacuum form machine by building each of us one that looked the same, even though it was hand built through and through. And it's time to break this out and show you how a model maker uses a small vacuum former to great advantage. Vacuum forming. Like I said, it begins with what's called a buck. Vacuum forming is a process whereby you take a sheet of plastic like this. This is styrene, one of my favorite materials. You heat it up, and when you heat it up, it's a thermoplastic, so it gets soft and it starts to droop like a piece of cloth. You'll watch all this happen behind me. And then in order to turn that soft plastic into a shape you want, you take it and you pull it over what's called a buck. Now, if I pulled that plastic over just this piece of Wren Shape, it would create for me a plastic shell that looks just like this. Yeah, that would not be ideal because that's not an interesting shape. But if you made this an interesting shape, you could actually use that to make a plastic mold for chocolate bars, for instance, which was my first experience of vacuum forming. My high school art teacher, Mr. Benton, had a small vacuum former, and we used it to make custom chocolate bars. I'm pretty sure we made some obscene ones. At least we spelled some dirty words on them. So the first thing to do with your buck is to sculpt it into the form that you want, and that's what I'm about to do. I'm literally going to make up a spaceship from scratch here. So I am going to make some drawing lines on this, then I'm going to cut it, shape it, sand it, and then we'll turn it into a buck for the vacuum former. I've drawn a shape. I'm not actually sure. I don't have a clear vision in my head of what this ship is going to look like. So I am literally winging it. I'm going to start to cut this out, and I'm going to treat it like a buck, and then we'll see where it takes me aesthetically. One of the things about Wren Shape, which I'm using, that makes it an ideal model making material is it has the same texture no matter how you slice it. One of the lower cost materials to use for projects like this would be particle board, either regular or lightweight particle board. And I have used that tremendously. But with particle board, you have a smooth surface, but when you cut it, the edge can be ratty and requires some filler and some smoothing. Wren Shape does not have that issue of having a grain or an interior to it that requires more finishing than its exterior. No matter where you sand Wren Shape, it's the same texture, and that makes it really lovely. It's expensive, however. A single sheet can be in the hundreds of dollars. But what's really cool is if you work in a model shop, they throw out chunks like this all the time because it's not even worth storing that. And I built a lot of my early stock of Wren shape from the trash bin at Industrial Light and Magic, like a lot of my fellow model makers like Fawn Davis and Dave Fogler and John Duncan, John Goodson. Yeah, the trash bin of a model shop is very fruitful for a young freelance modeler. Sanding is, of course, key to getting the right texture on Wren shape. And I used to make my own sanding sticks out of tongue depressors and sandpaper. And then I was in a beauty shop and I discovered that somebody already made those things. They are nail files and they come in 80 grit, 120 grit, 500, 600 grit. And I am never not without a stock of a few dozen of those. But I want to talk to you about how I'm holding it. I hold it in a very loose way. One, this allows me some fine motor control over feeling that I'm not sanding too deeply. In fact, when you're doing the final sand on a piece, most people think it's like this. And in fact, your final sanding passes may be as light as that you just literally, okay, get rid of that, yeah. Very, very tender and very light touch. And this is even like 180 grit, but even that is enough that I can see the result of every pass. And I'm holding it also like this, in this loose way, so that I don't develop carpal tunnel. If you're doing it like this is bad for your arm. You want a light touch. A light touch is better for your sensitivity of the object itself, and a light touch is also better for your body in general. All right, it's not much, but I've got a buck, I've got a secondary buck, and I'm gonna prep it for vacuum forming. Because this is going to be a whole ship, I can't vacuum form the whole thing at once. I need to cut it in half and vacuum form it in 2 halves. So I'm gonna show you how to do that, how to then cut it out and join it all together. Well, we had a little complication, which is that my vacuum former went onto the set of Savage Builds and came back to my shop without a key component. Every vacuum former is composed of 3 key parts. One is the heating element that softens up the plastic. The second is the vacuum that pulls that hot plastic over the form. And the third is a frame in which you suspend the plastic. And for this machine, I custom built this hinged metal frame, like a clamshell, that seals over a piece of plastic, holds it like a what do you call it? Like an embroidery ring, like when you're doing that kind of needlework, and allows me to pull it over this. But vacuum form machines are not exotic devices. There's a guy on YouTube, a wonderful maker whose name escapes me right now, who built a vacuum form machine that is really, really useful out of a garbage can lined with tin foil, a space heater, and a house vacuum cleaner. Seriously, it is that easy. So, not having the frame, I just grabbed some plywood from my wood stock and I suspended my piece of plastic in a wooden frame. And this should totally suffice to give me the seal I want to pull the vacuum form over the plastic. It's not perfect because I only get 1 shot out of it, but it will do for now. The first step for me here is to heat up the plastic. And these magnets normally hold my plastic in orientation, but because I don't have a metal frame, they can't quite do that. So I'm just gonna kind of have to hold this here. Is that really how I'm gonna do it? Wait a second. Let's see. Yeah, that'll do. All right, first we're gonna heat up the plastic. You can see I've actually built my own heating element here by buying some heating element wire and running it across some thermal insulation so that it doesn't make the top of this box too hot because it's always dusty. Yeah, you can see it's heating up right now. All right, here goes my plastic. Okay, now, while the plastic is heating, you have a certain amount of time. Here are the 2 halves of my buck, and here is the 3rd piece I want to vacuum form. I'm gonna get a pair of gloves. It's always good to have gloves to help your vacuum form, because if something doesn't quite seal, you want to help be able to push it down. And the plastic obviously is hot, and you can see it starting to buckle. So what happens first when you heat up the plastic is it goes up. And there's a really cool explanation for that, because what you're doing is you're heating all the molecules on the top of the sheet of plastic first. And like everything does when it heats up, that plastic expands. So it heats up, those molecules move farther apart, and they cause the plastic to bow up. And then as the heat moves through the plastic and warms everything to the same degree, the plastic evens out and stretches. Now you can see it's actually evenly stretched. But watch if I tap it. You'll see it's very soft now. It feels like kind of four-way stretch dance fabric. And one of the general rules of thumb is you want to let it droop about as far as the height of your buck. I'm going to go a little bit farther here, but we'll see. And then once it's time to pull it down, I'm going to have to act very fast, because I've got to turn off the heating element, pop it down, and pop on the vacuum. If I try the heating element and the vacuum at the same time, I blow a fuse. All right, pulling this back down over. There we go. Heat off, vacuum on. Not bad. I'll be honest, it's not perfect, but we can make it work for the purposes of this one-day build. All right. Plastic out here. That's why I love styrene. It cuts so easily. Okay. Now, when you're trying to join two halves of a buck together, it helps to be able to cut these two lines at a very, very precise height. And I use a wonderful device called a height gauge for that. Now, there are all sorts of other rules about using a vacuum former. And they are things like, if you're pulling a deep draft, you want your sides to be slightly slanted inwards. You actually want a little bit of a relief angle so it's easy to pull your vacuum form off that buck. There are aspects to putting your buck on a secondary platform so you can pull all the way to the bottom of it. There's also cutting outlines of your buck so you can press them down over in order to help the plastic conform to the buck itself. And that's often how plastic packaging is done, with both a former and a helper. But I'm doing the simplest possible version here in the interest of expediency. I didn't leave any draft angles on my buck for this one, and so it's being a little bit recalcitrant coming out of the plastic because all the edges are exactly vertical. I will tell you that my friends John Duncan and John Goodson built all of the model prototypes for episodes 1, 2, and 3. Excuse me. I assume they did this on episode 3 Star Wars, but I wasn't there, so I can't say directly. But they did all the ship prototypes for episodes 1 and 2 using these exact methods, making bucks out of wren shape, vacuum forming them, and then detailing them. So these are, like, I love these because they're non-exotic materials that can yield the most exotic results you can imagine. These are not pretty. That's sort of the point. I'm going to repair this so that I can get back to using it. So I had a little break there. I brought it back in with some cyanoacrylate glue and accelerator. Normally for the rest of this build, I'll be using a weld-on glue, weld-on number 3, and a brush. But for these big repairs, ending up with a nice gusset of acrylic like the cyanoacrylate glue gives me is much better for that kind of gross repair. Now, I have 2 halves of my buck, and I'm going to want to glue them together. And as you can see, they're not perfect, so I've got to bring them into alignment with each other before I start modifying and cutting them. And that's where this comes in. This is some sandpaper glued to a board, and it's a great way to finish a buck because it allows you to get a nice straight joining edge. Yeah. Anybody who's done this kind of model making will tell you that it's a lot of this. All right. Oh, already we have some radical improvement. Look at that. That's a nice edge, and that's a nice joint. Those will glue together well. Again, it's not super pretty, but it doesn't have to be for the purposes of our build. The really nice thing about surface gauges like this, and you can pick these up on Craigslist for a pretty reasonable price sometimes, is that their leading edge for measurement actually makes a very nice scoring blade for styrene, and that just happens to be the case. It's very satisfying when you have a nice, big, deep vacuform buck. I made all the vacuforms for the Weebos from Flubber, and I did hours and hours of this kind of scoring on those vacuforms. Perfect. Now, I've just added a kind of an internal border here, which would normally be how I attach the two halves of my buck together, but I'm gonna make this a wider ship. So I'm actually going to do the same thing on the other side, and then I'm gonna add in a middle section. It'll all be clear it'll all be clear in a second. Oh, all right, I guess I only have that kind. Oh yeah, this will do. Make your first score light, and then it won't help make your ruler wander. Just keep on making slightly harder scores as you go to keep your ruler sacrosanct, and then snap it off. Love that. So again, I've attached a little styrene shelf to the inside of both sides of my buck, and I'm now about to make it wider than it was before by adding in a 3/4 inch wide strip of styrene. I know it looks like kind of goofy right now, and that's sort of the point. The point is that you can really build anything with this method. Anything you can think of can be made using a vacuformer, a bunch of sheet styrene, an X-Acto blade, and a couple of glues. That threshold to entry for making stuff is nice and low. It's exactly my wheelhouse. So one of the things that model makers like are methods that allow them to hide crimes, as it were. And funnily enough, it's why there's more welding than there is fine carpentry in the model making industry, because it's a lot more easy to hide crimes with steel than it is with woodworking, actually. Look, there might be some woodworkers out there among you who disagree with me, but I'm about to show you, you're looking at this like, how the hell is that gonna look like a cool spaceship? And like, in less than 90 minutes, I'm gonna show you. Well, not like you're gonna have to watch another 90 minutes of video. It's gonna happen quicker for you. So remember, this was simply the piece of plastic that I pulled over a piece of wrench shape, but it gives me a repeatable shape. So I could make many of the same detail if I wanted, just by pulling more vacuum forms. For the film The Rainmaker with Matt Damon, the Francis Ford Coppola film from the John Grisham novel, some of the film was filmed in a courthouse in Louisiana, and then they replicated the set on Treasure Island. And the courtroom in Louisiana had something like 16 big cast iron radiators, and they couldn't ship them. It was just too expensive. So they hired Jamie Heinemann's shop to make a bunch of radiators that matched the radiators in Louisiana for the set on Treasure Island. And me and my team did that with vacuum form. It took us about 2.5 weeks. We made hundreds and hundreds of sections and then joined them into radiators. Oh, actually I have one. Wait right there. This is one of the radiators. Actually, the real ones were like 16 sections long, but I saved enough vacuum forms to make my own radiator. And you can see, it looks exactly like a radiator, except it weighs only about 1.5 pounds. This is the power of vacuum form. It's pretty awesome. Now, whenever you sand styrene like that on a belt sander, you end up with these burrs, but once you let them cool, they pop right off. So finishing the edge is really easy. Here we go, we got a bunch of burrs on here, watch this. Oop, gone, 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 no more burrs, no more burrs. Fabulous. Okay, so how am I gonna finish that? I'm gonna show you a cool technique on this front, which I think you'll like. There it is. It's not very attractive. However, once I let the weld bond set a little, I score, doot, and I do a little sanding. And the thing is, like, I'm doing all of my final shaping with these finger sanders, but you can use air sanders. People use Dremels. I know certain model makers who just like to do all this final carving with a very precise application of an X-Acto blade. That's one of Lauren Peterson's favorites. There's literally about 1 million different ways you can do all this final finishing. But the fact is, I had an open end and I closed it up, and now you can see that that is a really, really nice closed up edge there. And this is where styrene, the power of styrene, is so awesome for things like product prototypes. When you're a model maker in the film industry, when there's not work, sometimes I picked up toy prototyping work, which is very lucrative for a model maker. It's ludicrously exacting. Your client is going to pay a lot for that prototype, but they're going to expect something that is perfect. And styrene is one of the great ways to get there. I made a lot of product prototypes in exactly this method. So now I have my basic shape. I've widened it. I've got a form that I like as my spaceship. And this is going to be the engine. That's going to be the front. And now it's time to add some detailing before I do the most fun part, which is adding the greeblies. the kit bashing part. And what I'm gonna do to add those details is to use what's called evergreen styrene. Evergreen sells styrene in 1.5 million little shapes, from square pieces of every cross section to bits of C-channel here, wide strip, thin strip, flaps, angle, I-beam, everything. It's used for architectural model making extensively, and every model shop has a whole rack of this. I'm gonna add some smaller panel details. Stuff like, here we go. If I cut a trapezoid, oh, I wanted to show you a different kind of cutter here. Okay, so I'm using a pair of nice flush cutters here for this, but there's another type of cutter which I found, which is called the easy cutter. Here it is. And if you have a specific angle you want to cut, like, let's say you want to cut a 45. Put this like, is that a 45? No, that's a 45. There we go. If you want to cut a 45, you go like that, oink, and it cuts a 45 for you. Isn't that nice? Yeah, I really dig this thing. Nice long straight cuts. Don't cut anything but plastic with it, otherwise you will be unhappy. But it's a great little modeling tool. Again, the total cost of materials so far is about 20 cents. Okay, actually, if you buy some packs of styrene, let's say the cost were at around 12 or 15 bucks. Vacuum former, again, could be made out of garbage can tinfoil, a space heater, and a home vacuum, and some wood. The styrene doesn't cost anything. The glue doesn't cost very much. I love this technique because it is about the most versatile there is, and the threshold to entry is so low. See this? I'm making all the same part. I'm simply cutting to the same location each time, and all to the same angle. So, one other critical tool for model making with styrene, a good pair of tweezers. And I highly recommend Mr. Tweezerman tweezers from the beauty store. They are the shizzle. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna use all those identically shaped objects to make a little heat fins back here by the engines. Now this is a different technique for applying the weld-on. I'm actually soaking the bottom of the styrene in it. This is, you know, there's a lot of ways to get it. With this thicker pieces, it needs a little more time and exposure to the styrene to soften up. And that's just one of the ways. I've heard that for big fish tank assembly, they'll actually soak the edge in for a while. But all those guys, all those companies that make those big fish tanks for museums, they keep all their techniques secret. So I've never been able to really determine how they do what they do. That is neat. That's not bad. I'm pretty pleased with that. Give it a little cleanup here down at the bottom. Hide some of the crimes up front. Yeah, it's starting to look like a thing, isn't it? I think I'm ready to add some greeblies to this to do some kit bashing, so I'm gonna start cutting some model parts off of their trees. There's some parts and some pieces to play with, and there we go. Okay, I've got these great little boxes here. I'm gonna attach those around. Oh, you didn't even know how much fun this is gonna get. I've taught classes in building spaceships this style. I think for the purposes of this lesson, this ship is done. And I know it still kind of looks a little crappy, but that's because I haven't painted it. That's the most fun part. I'm gonna give it a coat of primer, and you'll get to watch it all come to fruition, as it were. All right. Well, there you have it. Spaceship Building 102. This is the completed model. And look, I know it's a little crunchy here and there, but it proves the point that literally this is a process by which you can make anything you can think of. It is an incredibly versatile and robust process that has a lot of room for fixing and solving the crimes and difficulties that you might encounter along the way. It's a very forgiving process, and it is the soul of the special effects modeling industry. Watching somebody do it who does it really well, there are a lot of people who do it better than me, is a rare, rare treat. But this is enough information to get you started.